Hey everybody, welcome back to Language of the Bible. I'm Harry, and today we continue our study in the Gospel of Mark. Last time we covered chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. Today we're going to be covering Mark chapter 1, verses 12 through 14. If you're interested, you could check down below in the description box for a list of all the different works I consulted in order to prepare for this study. So with no further ado, let's get straight into the verses. I'm going to read them here. And immediately the Spirit brought him out into the wilderness. And he, referring to Jesus, was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were serving him. So in verse 12, we see here that Jesus himself, he is being exiled. The Greek word is ekbalo, which is a word that later on will be used throughout the Gospel of Mark to describe Jesus' exorcisms. But Jesus is being forcefully thrown into the wilderness. Now we know that Jesus cooperated with this process, but it's interesting that Mark is using this wording in order to link Jesus with the Israelite experience where they were in the wilderness and they were sent out into the wilderness during the times of the Exodus. Remember that Mark is presenting the gospel and the story of Jesus in framework of the new exile experience described in the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. Therefore, he's going to use lots of Exodus language and Exodus imagery in order to describe the life of Jesus. And Jesus, as I mentioned in the previous video, he's representative of the true Israel, just as we have all of these servant songs in Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 42, Isaiah chapter 49, chapter 50, and the most famous one of all, Isaiah chapter 53. All of these suffering servant songs, if you will, refer to the nation of Israel, but also to a particular individual who himself would be representative of true Israel. And that one individual is Jesus the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach. So we see that Israel in Exodus chapter 6 verse 1, the same word, the same Greek verb, ekbalo, is used to describe Israel going out into the wilderness. So there's a direct connection between Jesus and his trip, his journey into the wilderness, and that of the children of Israel in the book of Exodus. The word choice is different here than in Matthew and Luke. We are also reminded how God casted out Adam and Eve from paradise after they sinned. And although the same exact word is not used, it's the same idea. They were forcefully sent out of the Garden of Eden and into the world after they had fallen, after they had disobeyed God. Jesus here serves not only as true Israel, but he also serves as the true Adam, a concept that the Apostle Paul will build upon in his letters. Now, Jesus is playing the role of true Israel, and he's playing the role of true Adam. Now, Jesus' time in the wilderness is reminiscent of both Moses and Elijah's time in the wilderness, two very important key prophets in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, who both had very important stays or interactions in the wilderness. And here, Jesus is being described as having his own experience, his own stay in the wilderness. We find in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, and in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 8, different passages that refer to Moses and Elijah and their time in the wilderness. Now, the number 40 is quite often associated with a time of trial in scripture, a time of trial and a time of testing. We find this in Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 to 12, where during the time of the flood lasted for 40 days. So again, a time of trial, a time of testing for Noah and his family within the ark. And we find this also in Jonah chapter 3, verse 4, a prophecy against Nineveh. So the number 40, again, associated with a time of trial and a time of testing. Jesus being tested is reminiscent of Abraham, who was also tested. Mark uses the same Greek word that the Septuagint uses to describe the temptation or the testing of Abraham, which is the Greek word peirazo. So we find this in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. Abraham is tempted, peirazo. He is tempted or tested by God himself. Abraham was tested in that which he loved the most, his son, his true heir, Isaac. Now, Jesus was tempted in what he loved most, which is his faith in his Father in heaven. In both of these cases, the answer to being tested was a self-denial and self-sacrifice or sacrifice. We have Israel being tested in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 20, verse 20, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2 and 16. It uses the Greek word ekperazo, which is a cognate of the verb perazo. So the Septuagint uses this word ekperazo to describe the temptation or the testing of the children of Israel during the Exodus experience. Also, this time of testing, this period of trial, was for 40 years. So again, we see that key number, the number 40, which in scripture, in the Hebrew scriptures, is associated with a time of duress. It's associated with a time of testing and a time of temptation. We find this in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 5, the reference to Israel being in the wilderness for 40 years. And yet we have another example of Jesus functioning as the true Israel. Just as Israel was sent out into the wilderness, just as Israel was tempted and tested in the wilderness, just as Israel endured a period of 40 in order to pass this test, Jesus too will be sent out into the wilderness. He will be tested and tempted with that which he loves most, just like Abraham was, and he will have to endure this for a period of 40, a period of 40 days. So we have Jesus here functioning as true Israel, and he is succeeding where the nation of Israel had actually failed, overcoming where the nation had actually succumbed. So we see here that God presents trials as a good thing, as opportunities to overcome sin. The word peirazo, the Greek word peirazo, can be translated tested or tempted. The words have similar but different connotations. Tested is more neutral and tempted is more negative. And we tend to only see the negative side of this word or this concept, peirazo. But there's also that positive side where God provides opportunities to come out on top. The scripture says that Jesus was with wild beasts, and the Greek word translated as wild beasts is therion. And this is mentioned ever so briefly, ever so matter-of-factly. There's no elaboration, no going into detail, just that he was with beasts. It doesn't necessarily say that Jesus was in danger from the wild beasts. As a matter of fact, when Mark uses the word meta, the Greek word for with, or translated here as with, it usually has a connotation of friendly association. So when the scripture here says that Jesus was with, the Greek word meta, the wild beast, therion, there is an implication here that this is a friendly or peaceful association. What we might have here is an allusion to Eden restored. We see in Eden, man or humanity, they were to rule over the wild beasts. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 uses the same word, therion, to describe the wild beasts over whom humanity would have dominion and rulership over. And this was to be a peaceful rulership at first. They were to name all the wild animals. We see this in Genesis chapter 2, verse 19 to 20. Again, therion. The wild animals are being named by Adam. They're being named by the first human. In the prophets, this is one of the things that is restored in the eschatological times, in the end times, in the Acharit Hayamim, the end days, the restoration of the relationship between humanity and wildlife, between humanity and the beasts, the animals out there. There would be a restoration of that peace-like harmony. We find this in particular in the prophet Isaiah, who was perhaps the greatest influence to the Gospel of Mark. As a matter of fact, almost 1/3 of Mark's quotations of Old Testament passages come from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah was very influential to Mark. He was very influential to all the gospel writers. And we find that in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 through 9, and Isaiah chapter 65, verse 25, we see this depiction of this Eden restored, where humanity and the animal life as well experience this harmony, this peaceful and friendly association. We also find this in other Old Testament prophets, such as Hosea chapter 2, verse 18, and Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 23 through 25. Now we're told in this passage in Mark that the angels would minister unto Jesus after his time, after his trial, or perhaps even during it, the angels would minister unto Jesus. And the Greek word is diakoneo. This reminds us of how angels protect those who make Yahweh their refuge. We find this in Psalm chapter 91, verses 11 through 13. The Greek verb is usually used in the domestic context for practical matters. Diakoneo is used in domestic context for practical matters of the home. In particular, it's used often for the serving of food, kind of like a waiter would. In Luke chapter 12, verse 37, and Luke chapter 17, verse 8, we find examples of this more domestic servant-like implication or nuance to the Greek word diakoneo. We get our English word deacon from the Greek word diakonos, which is a derivative of the Greek verb diakoneo, to serve. And in the New Testament, the deacons, these are people who their responsibility is to meet the practical needs of the widows and of the poor. As a matter of fact, in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, it tells of a legend where in Eden, angels served food to Adam and to Eve. So we see that same kind of nuance in the Babylonian Talmud described of the angels serving the first humans. And here they are serving the true Adam, the true human, the human par excellence, the Son of Man, Jesus, the Messiah. Here we have Jesus having fasted for 40 days, obviously experiencing hunger, and the angels are probably providing him food to eat at this point. This reminds us of Elijah, who also spent 40 days in the wilderness, also spent this time fasting, and who was also ministered unto by angels. We find this in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 5 through 6. So we see here a connection between Jesus and the wilderness prophet Elijah, a very important figure in the New Testament, in the book of Mark, and in the Old Testament prophets for the description of the end time and the ushering in of God's kingdom. We are told briefly that John the Baptist has been arrested. And the Greek word is paradidomi, which literally means to be handed over, to be given over to somebody else. Here we find the same verb that will be used later on in the Gospel of Mark to describe the arrest of Jesus. And Mark does this a lot in his gospel, where early on he is setting the terminology. He is defining his terms early on so that we can become familiar with them, so that later on during the times of the passion, the events leading up to and through the passion of Jesus, he's going to use these same words later on, and by then we'll understand exactly what they mean. But early on we see these allusions, these little hints and glimpses at the passion that later on will be a big part of Mark's gospel. So John the Baptist here is arrested just as Jesus would be later on, paradidomi. So we see here a preview of the destiny that awaits Jesus and a further link between the person of John the Baptist and the person of Jesus and their corresponding ministries. It's also important to note that Jesus' public ministry really took off after John, although there was a little bit of overlap. So there is a bit of overlap between their ministries, but most of Jesus' success came after the time of John the Baptist and after the time of his ministry. The verb here is in the passive form, handed over. And this tells us that John is not doing the action, but that it's being done to him, as opposed to a verb in the active voice. When a verb is active, then the subject is the doer of the action. However, when the verb is in the passive voice, the subject is the recipient of the action. He is having the action done to him, or she is having the action done to her, and there is another agent who is actively doing the action in question. So the person doing the action when a passive form is used is called the agent. Here, however, there is no explicit agent. Here, we have John the Baptist. He is being handed over. He is being arrested. However, there's no explicit agent mentioned. This is a very common Hebraic literary device that's referred to as the divine passive. So the divine passive is when you have this combination of factors. You have a verb in the passive voice. You have no express or explicit agent mentioned in connection with this verb. And it's implied that God himself is involved in this action. God himself is the agent who brings about this action. So by omitting the actual human agent of the action, the author is telling you that God has allowed this to happen. Now, while everything that happens can be described as something that a God allows to happen, what the divine passive serves to communicate is that this action is part of God's larger purpose. It's part of God's bigger plan. John the Baptist being handed over to King Herod and ultimately being executed was all part of God's plan. The divine passive teaches us that even when bad things happen, God is still in control. And that's something we need to hold on tight to, because there are a lot of bad things that happen to you and to me and to everybody around us. To know that despite the fact that these bad things do take place, our God is still in control. And that's it for today's video. Just covered 3 verses. Next time we'll move into the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and we're getting into some really exciting stories, some really exciting passages. Really looking forward to doing that. Please comment down below, guys. Tell me any questions you have concerning these verses, any disagreements, any concerns, any prayer requests, any feedback. We're here to listen. Take care and God bless. Bye-bye.